Hey there, my name's Rod Yates and you're listening to Humans of Music, a Jaxsta podcast. Each episode I talk to a music creator or industry professional about their life and career, the ups and downs of their journey and the lessons they've learned along the way. And my guest today is singer, songwriter, author and artist Amanda Palmer. Amanda first gained widespread recognition in 2003 when her band the Dresden Dolls released their self-titled debut album. On the back of hits like Coin-Operated Boy, they travelled the world, never saying no to any opportunity, often to their own physical and mental detriment. But it was a few years later, in 2012, that Amanda really captured the world's attention when she raised $1.2 million through a Kickstarter campaign to record her album Theatre is Evil. It led to a TED Talk that's been viewed online almost 6 million times and the release of her memoir, The Art of Asking. In many ways, it kickstarted a love-hate relationship between Amanda and the internet. On the upside, she's been able to connect directly with her fan base via platforms such as Patreon and build an engaged, supportive relationship with her following. On the other hand, Amanda has well and truly felt the wrath of the internet. There was outrage when she asked musicians to work without pay shortly after that Kickstarter success, and she was widely attacked for writing a poem referencing Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev in the wake of that bombing tragedy. Despite such controversies, Amanda has never shied away from following her artistic muse. She's just started her own podcast, The Art of Asking Everything, and last year released her most confronting album yet, There Will Be No Intermission. The album charts Amanda's experiences over the 7 years leading up to its creation, in which she had 2 abortions and a miscarriage, lost an ex-boyfriend to suicide and one of her dearest friends to cancer, all while experiencing the joy of having her first son. She was touring the album in New Zealand in March when COVID put the world into lockdown, and she's been there ever since. So we started the conversation by talking about why she made that decision to stay in New Zealand rather than return home to America.
I considered leaving every day of April and every day of May and most days in June. I just kept forecasting when I was going to get back home to New York. And then at a certain point, I just took my hands off the wheel and said, I just don't think it's safe to bring my child home to America, and I'm going to slow down, stay here, and wait, because the election is coming, winter is coming, a new wave of COVID is probably coming, and my child is safe here. And I spent the first few years of motherhood just kind of, it's hard to explain, but, when you've got a little baby, I didn't really have to reprioritize my life as much as I was expecting to, because the kid just followed my agenda. I went on tour and I brought the baby. I wanted to go to Australia and I brought the baby. We needed to go to South Africa for Neil's work and we brought the kid. And for the first time, the tables are really turned and I am following his agenda, which is we're in a global pandemic. This is one of the only places on earth where he can run around with a gaggle of kids without ever seeing someone in a mask. And I'm like, man, okay, we're staying here.
That's quite a big mind shift to I guess, surrender to that. The fact that you are now being led by your child to an extent where previously that wasn't the case.
Yes, it has been an interesting journey. And, speaking of music, like that has been another part of this is, there was a part of me as a musician and a songwriter that felt like I was going to have to deny and compartmentalize parenthood and motherhood if I wanted to maintain my identity, as a songwriter and as an artist and as a musician. And then there came a certain point where I was like, oh no, that's bullshit. This is, parenthood and motherhood is now going to be a huge part of my out identity. I'm not going to hide that. I'm going to use all of this material because I have it. And, I think that's such an important, perilous part of especially women, what we go through when we're faced with the decision of whether or not to have children is like, what are we going to have to sacrifice in terms of our image as songwriters and as artists? And are we going to look uncool because all of a sudden we're saddled with children? but then you realize that children also can like grab you and take you into this newer depth of meaning and writing and synthesizing the world and spewing it back out in art and song. And that has definitely been the case, like especially in the last couple of years with my kid.
So going back to your own upbringing, I know you were raised in Boston, and I've seen you describe the area in which you lived as a leafy green suburb. But I've also seen you describe yourself as having been a weird, troubled kid. In what way was that true?
In what way was I a weird, troubled kid? I mean, I was raised in suburbia, but I felt desperately unseen and very alone. And I was, I was the youngest of four kids in a mixed family with two older step siblings. Um, and I really felt like an outsider within my family, within my neighborhood, within, the schools that I went to, and at a certain point I did what a lot of like punk and goth kids do, which is I really like embraced it and, played the kind of cartoon caricature outsider. And I think that, that switch happened when I was maybe 14 or 15, and I decided to just stop trying to make friends with the popular kids and fully embrace my freak flag and, dye my hair purple and stomp around looking as weird as possible. But as I grow older, and especially as I watch my own kid trying to navigate community, one of the things that is so striking about the way I grew up is how little community there was. I was part of a nuclear family, and everything sort of looked great on paper, but I didn't really know our neighbors. I didn't really feel at home in anybody else's house. I didn't have like loving, ebullient, extended family around me. Like I didn't feel safe and known by the people who were just in our immediate surroundings. And I think a lot of people take that for granted. But when you really look at how we're supposed to function as a human family, that's really weird and disorienting. When you grow up sort of looking at all of these other humanoids around you and you don't really know them and you don't really feel welcome by them.
Did you ever share that with your parents or your mother?
Well, when you're 15, you don't fucking understand that. Because when you're 15, you just accept reality as it is plonked down on the table. So at 15, I didn't understand why I was so unhappy. I just knew that I was. And, sometimes it can take you until you're in your 20s, 30s, and 40s to sort of get a wide enough perspective to go back and go like, yeah, so maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it was the situation.
Obviously, you're very artistic, and presumably those artistic tendencies started to show at a young age. I think you started learning piano at the age of 3, but your parents were from quite scientific pursuits. I think your mum was a computer scientist and your dad was a physicist. Was there a time when you sensed that maybe your interests didn't align with theirs? And do you think that contributed to the disconnect in hindsight?
Perhaps. I think that's kind of a chicken egg question. I definitely embraced the idea of being an artist really early. And also my older brother, Carl, who I worshipped and adored, was also an artist. He was a painter and a bass player. He gave me a lot of my early albums, and he was sort of the first one who opened up the door to that world, like the idea of music and artists and, this other planet that my family kind of didn't live on. And, I was so enthralled by music and records and MTV. And it, in that world that obviously existed, because obviously like Prince inhabited that world, and like so did Madonna and the Beatles and Cyndi Lauper. Like they all lived on planet art. And I just had this idea from the time I was 7 that like if I could just get in the right vehicle, it would take me to planet art, and I would get to go be with those people. Um, and I didn't really see that as a rebellious opposition to my family. I don't think I ever embraced the mantle of being a songwriter or an artist as a way of separating myself from my family. I think it was more of a positive desire to like find connection with more people, and the kind of people who I wanted to hang out with, like the arty people who talked about their feelings and lived in this philosophical paradise of, deep, profound thinking and feeling. And, and songs to me, and writing songs and the ability to write songs were sort of like the architecture to make that rocket to get to that planet,
I think you were about 12 when you wrote your first song. Is that right?
Well, I think I probably wrote my first bad song when I was about 8. But, I wrote a lot of bad songs, and, I sat at the piano for many, many hours just fiddling around and figuring things out, and figuring out what notes sounded good with what other notes, and figuring out chords to songs that I liked, and in teaching myself by ear. And then, I think I started writing my first bad songs when I was, maybe like 10, 11, 12. And, and luckily, like, this was in the days before YouTube. So I had no camera and no easy access to the rest of the world. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have been like thrilled and tempted to to share those bad songs with the internet. And I think about this often in terms of the way artists and songwriters incubate. Like I was there incubating in a nice, dark, private little test tube without any kind of connection or stage to the rest of the world. And and I think that the internet and being able to share music out there has its pros and cons, but I find myself feeling very glad that that early material was not recorded, because it was pretty bad. But it was pretty bad in such a great way, right? Like it was pretty bad because it was just like the lyrics were bad and the chords were simple, and I was just copying Cyndi Lauper, and I was just trying so hard to sound like the people I worshipped, and I hadn't found my own voice yet. But every young artist has to go through that phase. I don't think you don't ever emerge fully formed. Everyone sort of goes through a period of copying and imitating and sloppy experimentation before you kind of land on the thing that's your thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think I landed there until I was 15 or 16.
Okay. I think it's so interesting that there's that gratitude that perhaps the internet wasn't around at that point, but later on in your career, the internet has become such an important part of your career, and a device which you've used incredibly well.
Yeah, and I mean, she's a fickle mistress. I adore the internet and the fact that I have built a vast community of very smart, very compassionate, very human people who have, come along with me in my rocket to planet art. But, the internet is also a very punishing place. And I have felt both sides of that in spades. And I would never change it. I have no regrets, but it is it's a very double-edged sword. It's a vulnerable place to be. And, I've cut my teeth on the internet as my band, I didn't really realize this until many years later, but my band basically started right when the internet started. The Dresden Dolls formed in 2000, like just when websites were becoming a thing.
Mm.
And we took it and embraced it and rolled with it. And as I went off in my solo career, I continued to be a very internet-based artist. But, I have felt the swinging door really smack me in the backside of the head many, many times. It's a hard place to be.
Yeah. And you've spoken in the past. I think I read a quote from you where you said, and you may not feel this way now, but you had, or perhaps still have, an unwillingness to feel unloved by someone. And the thing about the internet is that you can see very clearly when you're unloved. When in your career do you think you've felt most acutely unloved?
Oh, what a good question. I have surfed many waves of unlovedness. Yeah, and it's sort of like picking a favorite song or a favorite child. Like I don't think I could single out a peak moment. Certainly in 2013 when I published my poem about the Boston Marathon bomber, that was a hardcore moment.
Were you surprised at the reaction to that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was completely taken aback. I thought I was writing a little stream of consciousness poem for my blog, and then it was national news, and I was pretty devastated. But what's interesting is I forget how you phrased the question, but you said something like as an artist or as a musician. And that's interestingly a distinction that one could make. Like there are moments where I have felt, unloved as the human being, Amanda Palmer. And then there are moments where I have felt unloved as Amanda, the songwriter. And I sort of have various identities on the internet, and you can look at those vulnerabilities as sort of two different flavors of existence, because I've had moments like the Boston Marathon bombing where I wrote a dumb poem and all of a sudden there are 5,000 tweets telling me that I should be raped and killed and have a bomb shoved up my cunt. Mm. And that hurts in a very particular way. And then there are moments where I have slaved on a really, really well-written song and given it tip-top production with some top people and released that song out to the internet, only to watch it kind of get washed away with the daily news cycle because something else happens and my fetal song like doesn't get its due. And that's a different kind of pain, and all of those things sort of have their moments in the like ebb and flow of being an artist in conversation with the world.
Sure. So you've spoken about your Patreon and the patrons who support you through that, and how I think there was a tweet recently where you said that they'd saved your sanity. Is that a refuge when your songs get washed away in the news cycle? Is there a refuge to know that there is at least that community that did hear it and did see you?
Well, that's a complicated question, because on the one hand, yes, it is the ultimate refuge. On the other hand, just because people are giving me $5 per song or offering, it doesn't necessarily mean they are going to listen to and download it. So even within that safety cave of ultimate safety, that just because people are giving me money to create art does not necessarily mean they are tuned in 24/7. And that is as that's sort of its own hump that I've had to get over egotistically. And I have welcomed and trained so many other songwriters into the world of Patreon and sort of taught them the ropes. And one of the most important tools in your belt when you become an artist supported by patronage is to understand that just because people are patronizing you does not mean that they are sitting there at their table just waiting for you to drop something into their inbox so that they can immediately listen. And the metaphor that I use for that constantly, so that artists can really wrap their heads around it, is that you sort of have to think of yourself like NPR. And very specifically NPR, like American public radio, that is actually like listener funded. It isn't funded by the government. It isn't funded through some like magical grant from the sky. It's funded by the people who listen to it. But even the people who listen to it, who give $5,000 a year to NPR, aren't just sitting there listening to NPR.
Sure.
They just want it to exist so that anyone can tune in anytime and receive the broadcast. And that's sort of how you have to function as a patron supported artist, is you just have to put your head down and say, I am broadcasting. My voice matters in the world, and these people are giving me $5 a month because they believe that, whether or not they download the podcast or download the song or watch the video.
Is it important? I mean, this maybe is a silly question. Is it important to you that as many people hear what you do as possible, or is the act of doing it not enough?
It's somewhere in between. But I actually, I spent a lot of this past year, or rather 2019, which was basically the year that I toured my last album, There Will Be No Intermission, all around the globe. I really confronted what it means to be recognized, and really did a deep dive into why am I doing this? Why am I making songs? Why, when I have a child and I could just be at home in upstate New York making kale soup, why am I getting on a train today, on a plane today, in a tour bus today? Why am I doing this? And how many people is enough? And if I'm doing this show and exhausting myself, how many people is enough to make this act worthwhile? And it was really fascinating, because at the end of the day, I found myself really, for the first time in my career, saying, if one person leaves this show having felt something, I'm good. I'm good. I'm really good. And obviously, like, more than one person left the show having felt something. And given what was going on politically, and given the fact that the show was about abortion and miscarriage and, the human rights of pregnant people and the choices that we are and are not allowed to make in society right now, it felt seismic. But also, I run my shows and my career differently than certain other artists. Like, I did a 4-hour show, and then I also sat down and listened to people's abortion stories. Like, not everybody tours that way. And so, I have to think about scale all the time, right? Because I have a staff. Just to run my basic career costs tens of thousands of dollars a month. And if I don't bring enough money in, I can't pay Haley's salary, and I can't pay Michael's salary, and I can't run our office in New York and pay everyone's phone bills and blah, 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 blah. But I have definitely gotten to the point where I'm like, as long as we're in the black, I'm good. And, the pandemic has been really interesting that way, because a lot of my contemporary indie songwriters have had to shut up shop and furlough people and fire people. And I have been allowed to keep my business rolling only by virtue of the fact that I have a patronage system.
After the break, Amanda talks about the rise of the Dresden Dolls and what she calls the currency of connection. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Amanda Palmer. In the years between leaving arts college and finding success with the Dresden Dolls, Amanda supported herself in a number of jobs, one of which was stripping and the other was busking as a living statue called the 8-Foot Bride. They're both occupations that exposed Amanda to different sides of humanity, and we pick up the conversation discussing what she learned about people while doing these jobs.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, I mean, there was a vast spectrum. And I write about that era of my life pretty extensively in my memoir, In the Art of Asking, because those jobs were actually very similar. You're, as a living statue, you're silently on display, but people are projecting madly onto you. And as a stripper, it's sort of the same thing, except you are naked. But in both performances, you are sort of up there on display on a box, sort of like being this alluring thing that people are throwing dollar bills at. and both performances are silent. I was much, as a living statue, I was very still. And as a stripper, I was not quite so still. But, the poetry between those two jobs was an endless conversation. And I was doing them both at the same time. I mean, if I wanted to distill it, the living statue gig was fascinating because, I was really at the mercy of the humanity passing me by. I literally had my legs bound up in a skirt so someone could tip me over if they wanted to.
Did they?
Yeah, sometimes they did. I was assaulted a couple of times. And also I was a student of meditation, and I treated my street performance as a meditation and as a constant practice in non-reactivity, because that's basically what I was doing. And I sort of clock all of those hundreds, thousands of hours up on the living statue boxes, kind of a thread of meditation practice. And I dealt with a lot of beauty and ugliness of humanity, and the most striking thing about it is that my reaction, was very still and small and slow, and so different from the kind of persona that you see when, Amanda joins the Dresden Dolls and gets up like screeching and loud at a piano. And as a stripper, what's interesting is that when people think about stripping, there's a lot about the job that people don't know. So, I definitely was up there dancing naked on a stage and grinding around on a pole and all that, showing my boobs and vagina to, a crowd of super predominantly men. But the dough that I made actually came from what's called mixing, which is when you finish dancing and you stick on your dress and you go down to the floor and convince people to try and hang out with you. And if they want to hang out with you, they need to buy you drinks, and the bar gets a 70% cut and you get a 30% cut of these drinks that are marked up by 3,000%. And that's how you make your money. It's a social contract job. Mm. And so the vast majority of the time that I was in the strip club, I wasn't dancing. I was talking with strangers. And you're kind of a weird, lonely therapist type, because mostly what men want when they come into a strip club is the company of women.
It's that thing about forging a connection, isn't it? Which seems to be a constant theme throughout your career, that search for connection.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the that's the fundamental theme here, isn't it?
Mm.
Like people wanting connection with another people. And I found that in my job as a living statue in both directions, and as a stripper and as a musician.
And you mentioned when you got up on stage with the Dresden Dolls and you were playing piano and screaming, was part of that, do you think, exercising some of the pent up things that you were subjected to, being pushed over, being abused as a living statue, even though your reaction at the time was very slow and it was quite meditative? Did it come out in that way?
You could probably draw a line from A to B there. But I had also spent my entire life feeling unheard, unseen, and enraged. So it wasn't just the few years of living statue-ness that I had a, universal bone to pick with. I grew up as a woman in the patriarchy. I had a lot of feelings to express.
So when the Dresden Dolls have some hits and success, with songs like Coin Operated Boy, did that fill any of that hole or that void in you?
Oh my God, there's a song right there. I mean, did it fill the hole, Amanda? Did it fill the hole? That's gonna be the showstopper at the end of my biopic musical. I don't know if it filled the fucking hole. I still don't know. That's not my job to answer that question. Maybe. I think one of the things you learn as a songwriter and as an artist who craves connection and craves recognition, and by recognition I don't even mean fame or commercial recognition, but I just mean like human recognition, which is I think what we're all pretty much after in this game. There's layers of this spiraling kaleidoscope of what it means to be seen. And all you have to do is look back at the long, painful legacy of performers and songwriters and actors who, were sometimes the most visible and the most seen, and yet still felt unfulfilled and still felt unrecognized and unseen at the basic fundamental level. And it's been a hallmark of my career that I've sort of zigzagged through, the bizarre woods of gaining attention and gaining recognition, but then sort of retreating with the goods, into the back room and away from the commercial spotlight so that I could like open up the bag and try and enjoy what I had picked up. And, my retreat away from a major label, my retreat away from doing anything corporate, my retreat away from ever trying to get on the radio. Like, I think a lot of those things were, if not subconscious, sort of like weirdly deliberate choices to try to actually excavate what was worthwhile from recognition without being fucking eaten alive by it, So
it's protection in some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, if the currency is connection, you can only spend it if you're still living in the human realm. And once you jump out of the human realm into, like, say, the real celebrity realm, a lot of that currency becomes unspendable because you're trapped.
Right.
And so a lot of my career has been sort of looking around and going like, wow, okay, I've earned all of this currency. I'm allowed to connect with all these people. I don't want to necessarily jump up to the next level where all of this currency is going to sink in value, because if I leave my house, someone's going to take a picture of me.
Right. And I guess one of the first examples of you really getting that currency in an empowering way was the 2012 Kickstarter campaign, which led to you raising $1.2 million and recording the Theatre is Evil album. And then from that came the TEDx talk and the Art of Asking book. But throughout that period, did you ever feel like that accomplishment of raising that money overshadowed your actual art, that you became Amanda Palmer who raised lots of money as opposed to Amanda Palmer the artist?
Well, I think you just answered your own question by even asking it. I mean, and the answer is yes. But also, had that overshadowing not happened, I would not have written a book, and I don't think I would have turned to patronage. And because I was really painted into a corner and forced, at least it felt to me, forced to defend and explain myself again and again and again, I became what I preached. And instead of hanging out and trying to make my way in the standardized music business, I just fucking packed up and went off-road and off-grid. And never in my career have I looked at the kind of jagged zigzag path that I took to where I landed now and been more relieved that I made the choices I made. Because I will tell you that being trapped in a pandemic without really being able to tour, but having a massive, reliable income is just, it's not something that I plotted out 5 years ago. But the fact that it's manifested this way and that I have a safety net a mile wide without having to tour is about the best thing that could have happened.
After the break, Amanda talks about being so open in her art and whether there are any areas of her life that are off limits. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Amanda Palmer. In the period leading up to the writing of There Will Be No Intermission, Amanda experienced loss in many forms, whether it be having 2 abortions and a miscarriage, losing a former lover to suicide, or watching one of her best friends die from cancer. We pick up the conversation discussing what she learned about death throughout this period.
Well, what's funny is I thought that I was going to wrap up that tragic era of my life, do a tour about it, and then go home to America and be happy. And guess what didn't happen? So I actually feel like I am continuing to stumble along in that story. And I mean, what's hilarious and poetic is, that was the theme of the tour. There is no intermission. Life does not dole out its hardships and tragedies in bite-sized chunks. And I think the main thing I learned from death is that it is part of life. And it is nothing to be feared. Neither is loss. And I think we are so bad at that. We are so bad at grief and facing loss and facing change. And I just started my own podcast, and one of my favorite interviews that I do is with this guy, BJ Miller, and he's a doctor. But he's also an expert in palliative care and end-of-life care. And we had a great talk about how miserably disconnected and far from the plot Western society and Americans in particular, just how bad we are at death, and how we desperately want to escape it, and we desperately want to deny it. And we are desperately bad at dealing with it when it happens to someone in our family, and to, and we feel like we've progressed in all of these ways, but we have also ditched so many good tools and rituals, as we have fled into the future of progress. And you can see the ricochet and the side effects of that madness everywhere you look. And I feel the same way about birth. And I learned a lot about that, giving birth to a child. I learned a lot about that when I had a miscarriage. Like, we just don't have ways of dealing with this. We were not taught. We don't get taught. And, if we get taught anything, it's to just like shut up and deal, and do not share it. And if you just close your eyes and put your hands over your ears, it will just sort of pass and go away. And as a songwriter, I think I made a very deliberate choice to dive into that stuff and say, fuck it, there's a better way. I'm going to attack this stuff head on, and I'm not only going to write material about it, I'm going to tour, I'm going to talk to my audience about it, and I am going to fight back with like the most powerful tool in my arsenal, which is I am not going to shut up about this stuff. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to say uncomfortable after uncomfortable thing, because I'm not afraid anymore, and because I know how much comfort it is going to bring my audience to hear these words spoken.
And is it because of writing the songs and because of touring and having those conversations that you're not afraid, or did something? What was it that made that took that fear away, that allowed you to confront death and birth in this way?
Well, I think it's sort of like chicken egg question, because making art and speaking openly about the dark continually helps me to confront the dark without fear, and vice versa. I mean, it's sort of an endless loop vehicle out of hell to be able to make art about the dark is sort of the vehicle that you get into in order to exit. And they have words for this in art. We call it catharsis. There's a reason that some of our oldest pieces of art are not about happy things. Human beings have needed to do this in order to process since the dawn of time.
Mm. And I know that I think that you experienced death at an even earlier age, when you were around 19. And I think the same year that your grandparents passed away, you also lost a brother and a former partner. Looking back now, can you see how those experiences changed you?
I think I can. I mean, a lot of that I worked out on stage as I was touring, because I told that story every night at the beginning of my show. And, at the time, I didn't have any capacity to deal with that amount of death and tragedy. And coincidentally, I was living overseas and away from my family for the first time, and with like easy access to alcohol for the first time. So I mostly spent that year of my life very drunk, and having lots of sex with lots of people, and mostly just, careening around, in a like chaotic pattern of avoidance. But also, I think I didn't write a lot at the time. I had been prescribed Zoloft by my school psychologist and psychiatrist, and I went into a very, very dark period where I was just trying to study and finish my degree and make my family happy, because you really had to, you had to graduate college in my family if you were going to get the pass. And I really just hunkered down for a few years and didn't express anything. I just sort of became this dark sponge. But waiting for me on the other side of that was the Dresden Dolls. And getting back to your question about loud, explosive, expressive Amanda, I mean, that was the girl on the other side.
Hmm.
And, you know, if you look at early footage of the Dresden Dolls and you see me face painted and howling at top volume, pounding my piano at top volume with another human being, you know, Brian Viglione, a drummer who had gone through his own personal trauma and tragedy in the preceding 10 years. You know, the two of us had a lot to fucking get off our chests. And it is what made us such a powerful band. I mean, Brian and I did not fucking hold back for 2 seconds on stage. You put me and that guy on stage, and we just were like a professional catharsis machine. And we were fucking good at it because we knew how to play our instruments and we understood our gear and we crafted our songs, and then we got on stage and we just exploded every night in pain and agony, and people could relate to the sincerity of, you know, pain and humor and no holds barred expression that we were offering up. And it's why the band worked.
And you mentioned the word sincerity there. I've read about you talking about, I think one of your earliest memories was not being believed when you fell down the stairs as a 3-year-old and your family didn't believe that that had happened, and that scarred you in some ways. So the word sincerity and the fact that people connected with that sincerity and therefore believed in you, that must have been incredibly important and also liberating.
Yes, it felt fucking fantastic. And it was a, you know, that sort of validation and being seen at my most vulnerable, which is what the song, you know, the early songs of the Dresden Dolls were incredibly vulnerable. And being seen that way and validated that way by our audience was deeply delicious.
Mm-hmm.
And also hard to control in certain ways because, you know, our band started very small and we toured, you know, very locally for a while and out of the back of a car for many years. But then, you know, when our star ascended, it happened pretty quickly. And we went from playing to 100 people in Boston to playing, you know, to 2,000 people all over Europe in only a few years. And that hunger that I had to be seen and to connect with these people was so, you know, was still so insatiable. And our delight in being wanted was so delightful that we never really paced ourselves, which is why the Dresden Dolls did burn out as fast as we did, because we just didn't say no to a single fucking gig, which meant, and no one was really keeping their eye on that. No one looked at the band's schedule and said, God, you guys might want to pace yourself. Which meant that there were many moments where we were playing a show in America, getting on a plane, playing a show in the UK, not getting any sleep, getting on a plane, landing in Japan and playing a show in Tokyo. And no one looked at the schedule and said, you guys, this is not fucking sustainable. And we looked at the schedule and we were like, fuck it, rock and roll, let's do it. No sleep till Brooklyn, punk rock, ah. And then, of course, you know, you look at the human toll, and the two of us were constantly getting sick, and we were irritable, and we were angry, and we were very unhealthy. And, you know, and we did not have like a mom, in our professional circle to turn around and be like, dude, like, this is not okay. You can't say yes to 5 gigs in 5 continents in 5 days. Like, bad idea. So, we just toured until we died, and then something had to give, and we finally just sort of drove ourselves off a cliff in 2007, and that wasn't reparable for a few years. Brian and I we ate it. But we did tour the world non-fucking stop for 3 years before we ate it. But yeah, it was not a sustainable lifestyle for sure.
You talked, one of the words you used in there, which we've used a couple of times throughout this interview, is the word connection, and how powerful that connection was, and to feel seen in those early days of the Dresden Dolls. And again, that's been a constant throughout your career, and particularly with There Will Be No Intermission and the tour that you did around it, that connection that you're forming with your audience from being so honest about pretty uncomfortable topics. Is there ever anything that you keep for yourself?
Well, there's certain things I have to keep to myself, obviously, because discussing them would be unfair and too damaging. I don't write about my marriage. Not really. I certainly don't write about problems within my family. There's a lot of stuff that's just off the table. But of course, all of those things emotionally float into other worlds and, disguise themselves in hats and gloves and masks and show up unseen and uninvited in metaphor form all over the place. So, we're writers. I'm a poet. It's hard to distinguish one thing from another, and so it should be, and Neil is the same way. It's sort of like my husband, he writes fiction, and if you look at any given book of his, it's like, so is this a book about you? Is this a book about your family? Is this a book about your upbringing? And it's like, yes, it's everything.
Yeah.
And that is the power of fiction, and the power of poetry and songwriting is, if it's good, you can't pin it down. You shouldn't be able to. That's why it's art. And the thing that I enjoy about growing older and more mature as a songwriter is expanding that palette and that constant reminder that, like, anything goes. Anything can go into the mix, into the blender, into the compost of this particular song, this particular lyric. Anything is fair game. I can take television commercial jingles that I remember from 1981 and sneak them into a bridge of a song that I'm writing in 2021. Like, that's all fair. It's all fair. And, I've had so many moments like that as a songwriter, writing songs, and you're sitting there at the piano going like, oh my God, is this allowed? Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to say that? Am I allowed to quote this? Am I allowed? And the muscle that has just grown stronger as I've grown older as a songwriter is like, yeah, it's fucking all allowed. Like, you can do anything. No one has ever come in yet with a warrant saying like, hey, that's not allowed. So, until someone comes in and says like, yeah, that's not allowed, I am going to continue to like push it as far as I can in my songwriting, in my prose writing, on my blog, in my tweets, to just see about how far I can go, because hopefully, like at the last stop on the art subway, I might eventually get to the land of not allowed, but hopefully I'll die before that happens.
And I love it. Even though you have felt the wrath of the internet from time to time, you're still unrepentant, unapologetic about pushing that boundary, and doing so knowing that the internet may slap you back again sometime.
Well, the best art really is unapologetic and should be. Art that apologizes for itself is inherently problematic. And as a human being, there have been many times that I have happily and authentically apologized for causing suffering. And I'm sure it will happen again and again. But as an artist, I think it's very important that we remember as writers and as poets and as painters and as dancers and as sculptors, the most important thing we can do is reach down to the very depths and make an unapologetic offering. Because in essence, that's usually where the best art originates.
Yeah.
You know, and then we figure it out.
Amanda, just before we finish up, Jaxsta is all about giving credit where credit is due. Are there people that you would give credit to for helping you get where you are today?
Oh, yes. You know, I was just thinking about that lately. I was taking a walk yesterday and wishing I could do an acknowledgements for my life. Actually, right now, my friend Xanthia O'Connor, who got on a plane last minute when I came over to lockdown in New Zealand and thought that she was going to be leaving her life in Melbourne for 2 weeks to come help me out with my kid, has now been living in New Zealand for 6 months, away from her country for the first time, away from her family, helping me raise my child, helping me create my podcast, and just one of those unsung heroes of life. And I'm not sure how I would have gotten through the past 6 months without her. And she deserves a fuck ton of credit. And my team in general, they don't get a lot of acknowledgement. I have a manager who helps me with my life and keeps me sane, Jordan Verzar. He lives in Sydney. My assistant, Michael, who lives in New York and has been locked down, you know, and also went through a month having contracted COVID. He has been one of the unsung heroes of my life. And my other employee in New York, Haley, who basically helps me run my entire community and my Patreon. These are sort of the angels of my entire existence. And if I did not have these guys supporting me and helping me just wade through the mire on a day-to-day basis, I do not know what I would fucking do. And they are they are the wind beneath my wings. They're my family. And, I've got my biological family and they support me in a beautiful way. But I also have this art family and business family, which goes so far beyond just the business of selling and making art. They are really helping me enact change in the world. A lot of what we're doing even this week is just figuring out how we can mobilize my community to get people to vote and to make sure that Donald Trump gets out of office. And it's this is our job right now. All hands on deck. Let's fucking do this. And we have meetings over Zoom, and they deserve a lot of credit that they do not often get.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much, Amanda. It was really great chatting with you. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
And that's it for another episode of Humans of Music. A big thanks to Amanda for her time, and thank you for listening. This episode was mixed by Lachlan Mitchell from Parliament Studios in Annandale, and the incidental music and theme song were written and performed by Sam Lockwood. Please remember to subscribe to the Humans of Music podcast so you never miss an episode, or feel free to share it amongst your friends and jump online and rate and review it. And remember, Jaxsta Pro is currently free, so if you make music or work behind the scenes in the music industry, head to jaxsta.com and sign up to become a Jaxsta Pro member. Until the next episode of Humans of Music, I'm Rod Yates. Thank you for listening.